Ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, otherwise known as OHSS, is characterized by swollen ovaries and feelings of abdominal tenderness or sometimes pain. The risk factors for developing OHSS are not entirely understood, but it can be impacted by things like the quantity of eggs produced during your donation, as well as the medications that are used in the retrieval process. One study by Dr. Diane Tober found that the risk of developing severe OHSS was decreased when a Lupron trigger was used in the medication protocol and increased when a higher number of eggs was produced.
My own experience with ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome has really shaped how I would talk to other donors about it. When I was told about this as being a potential side effect of egg retrieval, I was always told that it was a very rare side effect, that there were different levels of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, but because the rate of it was so low, it wasn't really focused on during my medical consultation or the educational process with the clinic.
I was told that OHS was a possible side effect of the donation process. I was not fully informed of what OHS was, what it would feel like, what the possible consequences of OHS could be. And it very much was almost brushed aside as like when you're taking an Advil and they're like, side effects could include, and it's like seizures, heart attacks, things like that. And you're just kind of like, oh yeah, but that's fine. That's not going to happen to me. Whereas OHS is actually a very common thing. You just don't always experience it at the severity level of hospitalization.
I felt like the information that was given to me by the clinic was done in a very medically straightforward way. I was giving documents on ovarian hyperstimulation that talked about the different side effects, the different ways to know if it was at a mild, moderate, or severe level. It was almost like a pharmaceutical commercial, if that makes sense, where, it covers everything, but it's not really a conversation that you would have with the actual doctor. At least it wasn't for me. It's not something like super focused on during like the educational part of becoming a donor. But when you actually get OHSS, you find yourself, going back through those documents saying, okay, I've hit all of these different symptoms, and that you're trending towards like moderate or potentially severe OHSS. That when you go back to communicating with the doctor, there's a lot of additional things that I didn't know ahead of time, like certain medications can help reduce it, or if you hit a certain level of weight gain, you should go to the emergency room instead of waiting until the next day to go back to the fertility clinic, if that makes sense.
I absolutely had health complications from the donation. Nothing permanent, which is very exciting, but my second donation, I ended up with a thankfully mild to medium case of OHS, or ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, which manifested for me in just intense pain during my recovery. I needed to take medication to help the swelling in my abdomen because I couldn't eat, I couldn't drink. I would take a sip of water and I would feel painfully full, and I wouldn't be able to walk, I wouldn't be able to get up. And that was probably a solid 2 weeks of me sitting and just playing video games and willing the pain to go away. And I'm very grateful that it was a mild to medium case, but I know people who have been hospitalized with severe cases and in some cases had to have a hysterectomy because of it. So there was a very real risk of it being a low percent, but of losing my ability to have future children. A better way to deal with OHS for egg donors is to verbally sit them down and talk about it. I remember that most of my information on OHS came from an informational packet, which I did read. It wasn't that I just threw the informational packet away, but I think when you're reading a packet of information, it's very simple to overlook the severity of something as opposed to a doctor sitting down and really explaining to you, there is a chance that you are going to get this very specific side effect that could, in worst case scenarios, lead to you becoming infertile. Having someone say that to me would have made a very different impact.
Even though we had implemented additional medications to prevent it, taking a Lupron trigger, as soon as I had my retrieval, I knew that I was starting to have those symptoms. So really uncomfortable bloating, really rapid weight gain. It was difficult to breathe. It was difficult to stand up straight. Those were all symptoms I was having to also prompt me to call the doctor again and ask for follow-up. to make sure that it wasn't going to get any worse or become even more dangerous than it already is at a mild or moderate level of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So I would tell other donors that have concerns about ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome post-retrieval to have some sort of treatment plan in place for when they return home, especially if they did a travel cycle. Sometimes ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome can take time to manifest, and they've already returned back home from where they traveled to the original fertility clinic. I would definitely encourage donors to speak to the fertility clinic to know what kind of steps they should take, whether they should go see a fertility specialist near them or if they should go to the emergency room. It's definitely good to have a plan in place on how that information will be communicated to your providers.
Really document everything that happens to your body, from just, I feel tired this morning, to, oh, I feel a little bit crampy, to, oh, I didn't like this food today. Even if it seems like nothing, document it, because there's no research. So the minute that anything goes wrong, if it does go wrong, the best thing you can have on your side is the most detailed documentation of everything that you've gone through that you can hand to your doctor and say, this is when I noticed this symptom, this is when I noticed this symptom, how long has this been developing? Because if they can pinpoint exactly what happened, they can better treat you.
Based on my experience with OHSS, I would encourage donors to ask a lot of questions about both OHSS and any other potential side effects of egg donation. When you speak to the clinic, sometimes these side effects are presented in a way that it's a very rare thing to happen. But in talking to other donors and going through my own experience, I'm finding that a lot of donors have experience with OHSS to some extent. So instead of going over it very quickly during a medical evaluation or the educational process with your clinic, definitely research it beyond the educational materials that they give you. Ask questions about what side effects you need to look for and what kind of safeguards they're going to put in place for when you start trending towards having ovarian hyperstimulation post-retrieval. I would tell donors to only go into donating thinking that there's a high potential that they could get this sort of side effect, because it helps them better prepare with questions to ask the clinic, especially about how it will be prevented and at what point the clinic will make it seem as though that they need to prepare for a donor for potentially having ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome and needing to take care of that after egg retrieval.